It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. Slow week, right?
Oh, nothing happened this week.
Nothing happened at all.
Nothing that would change anybody's opinion of it.
All right, we'll try to scare something up for you to talk about. Okay. Also with us, I want to welcome Elena Gabrielon, reporter for the Russian service of sister station Radio France International. How are you?
Perfect, thanks.
All right, with us as well. Perfect. Okay.
Perfect.
All right, Laure Mondeville, who I hope is feeling perfect as well.
Absolutely. I just came back from Helsinki.
Helsinki. We'll talk about Helsinki. There you go. Helsinki. Laure Mondeville, senior correspondent for French broadsheet Le Figaro, and the author of Who is Donald Trump? And with us as well, Gregory Viscusi, reporter at Bloomberg News, and who's looking suspiciously tan. Have you been out of the
You say that every time. There's been sun in Paris recently.
There has been sun. I've even had a drought. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. # World This Week. Yes, with Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump had a ball. In Helsinki, the Russian president handing the his U.S. counterpart a souvenir from the World Cup. The World Cup, which had concluded the previous day. This after Trump doubted his own intelligence services and justice agencies at a press conference, and Putin smirked when asked whether he had any compromise on Trump, compromising material. You were at that press conference,
Yes, I was, and I can tell you that all the journalists there just were trying to pinch themselves. You know, we had this impression that we were witnessing something particularly surreal and incredible to see an American president disavow in front of the whole world and all these journalists, gathered his own country, his own intelligence services. It was du jamais vu, never seen. And this, standing side by side, of course, with a former spy of the KGB who has become, the president of Russia. And I think even Vladimir Putin, in a way, seemed a bit stunned, by when Trump said, I think I believe both, but in fact, I have no doubt that, no reason to not believe Vladimir Putin.
And how did Trump seem to you? Like, in his element, is this just all entertainment for him, or does he really believe the stuff he says?
I don't think so. I wrote a piece, about that, and I think actually there is an enigma about what Trump wanted, why Trump behaved that way. You can think that he's just a stupid guy and totally, out of line and doesn't care about anything. I think it's a bit simplistic, and I think there are other hypotheses which are important, possibly more, convincing, like, of course, the obsession of Trump with his legitimacy. And for him, saying it is the Russians who, they meddled into the election, that means giving up an inch on the fact that maybe there is some doubt about the legitimacy of his election. And he didn't want to go that far, apparently, and he's been, for 2 years now, just forcefully saying that he's a perfectly legitimate president. His election was no doubt not helped by the Russians. And of course, the observers have been wondering, why couldn't he make a distinction between, okay, I've been legitimately elected, but at the same time, there was a meddling into the election. And he could say, there is no collusion, I've never, had anything to do with the Russians, but at the same time admit, because there are so many facts, sort of laid out by his agencies, that the Russians meddled into this electoral process. And there is another potential explanation. I think, of course, there is the narcissistic sort of Trump approach, which is, I am more important than America. And one wonders, when he keeps saying America first, but this press conference was Trump first and Russia first. So people started to think, and I think it's quite a mistake on Trump's side. But at the same time, I wonder if there isn't another explanation, which would be that Trump, maybe naively, thinks that he can get to some kind of agreement with Putin, and that he's genuinely trying behind closed doors to not, make the Russian president angry and get to some kind of strategic agreements on things he thinks are important.
Christopher Dickey,
She said it all. No, in fact, I wouldn't disagree with anything that Laura said. The only thing I would add is that because there was so much focus on the question of election meddling, or in fact the full-on attack on American democracy that's been made by Russia, there's a tendency to miss the other ways in which Trump was manipulated, which I think Laura would probably agree with. He went into this meeting without adequate preparation. He went into it without any experts with him. Now, we can have all kinds of reasons that he might have done that, but that is what he did. And part of the reason is, I think without a question, if you watched him, that he thinks that his gut is better than people's brains. He thinks that he got to be president because he relied on his gut rather than what experts told him. And he thinks, I believe, that he went in to see Putin and his gut was going to see him through that encounter. Putin is completely the opposite. Putin is not only an experienced KGB case officer, he's been president of a very complicated country, or ruler of a complicated country, for 20 years now. So you have this guy going in relying on his gut, and then you have a guy who really knows lots of facts, has lots of information, and certainly knows how to manipulate people. And on every issue that they discuss that we know about, on Syria, for instance, on Iran, all of these issues, Trump came out, on Ukraine, for instance, and didn't have anything that he could articulate very well. In fact, on Ukraine, it was really bizarre. Putin answered for him. So you really had to think that this was a man who was totally manipulated, and he may still not realize that.
The White House denying today that something thrown out there by the Russian ambassador to the U.S. that Trump was considering perhaps a referendum for separatist parts of Ukraine.
Well, you know, I think that from this conference, what we saw exactly, it was not only the fact that Vladimir Putin has told we can't trust to each other, so we don't know about what exactly we trust to Trump or to Putin, but also to Vladimir Putin, because he was talking about Crimea, as you mentioned. For the first time, he told, we held the referendum. And this all Ukrainian media noticed that it was the first time. And what is very important is from the website of Kremlin, from the verbatim, this pronoun magically disappeared. And Donald Trump, he even didn't say, well, I think that Vladimir Putin recognized that Russia organized this referendum and not local authorities. So that was something maybe unconsciously Vladimir Putin recognized at this very moment. And
sure, but it's something that Trump wouldn't know, wouldn't fix on, wouldn't have any idea about.
Hey, guess what? There'll be a sequel. A tweet from the White House press secretary announcing a fall visit by Vladimir Putin to Washington. Not everyone, it seems, was in the know. At a conference in Colorado, NBC's Andrea Mitchell was on a panel with Trump's head of national intelligence.
The White House has announced on Twitter that Vladimir Putin is coming to the White House in the fall.
Say that again?
Vladimir Putin coming
Did I
to
hear
the...
you? Did I hear you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's going to be special.
Is he being glib there?
Well, I don't know. He could be in trouble with his boss for that. I mean, here he is at Aspen.
It sounds like he's being ironic a little bit.
He's kind of mocking his boss, though, no, in front of a rather elite crowd.
I think there's every reason to believe he didn't know.
Yeah, I think he just didn't know. I think he really just didn't know.
Yeah.
It's pretty. It's pretty clear that all the close advisors to Trump and his ministers are out of the loop on this one.
Germany's chancellor today saying this is a good idea. That it is good when leaders meet.
Not this leader.
It's good when leaders meet if it's prepared, but we still don't know. It'd be nice to know what was said in those 2 hours when they were alone. We have no idea what was said in those 2 hours. It might be nice to know what was agreed then in the first meeting before we start moving on to subsequent meetings as a first step.
What I think is interesting, I was talking to an American journalist from the Wall Street Journal today and asking him what he thinks about, what is happening now. And he told something interesting. He said, on the one hand, I think that a lot of the Trump supporters who were tepid about their support, for reasons of his behavior, maybe brutality, rude manners, and, disrupting style, etc., were starting to wonder. They may have been tipped to give him up in a way after the sequence of your European trip. But at the same time, he was saying something else. He was saying at the same time, the opposition to Trump has been so forceful to push the idea that Trump is a traitor, that he's a Manchurian candidate, that there is a huge file on him, that the Russians have him in their files, and that he's the prisoner of Putin, to such an extent, maybe over-exaggerating the whole thing, that they think that these tepid voters may be disliking so much this opposition for being so outrageously, against that it could bring them back to Trump. And I think this is an interesting dynamic, because we have to sort of figure out whether this is a watershed event or not. And I think that if Trump is able to bring Putin to Washington and somehow convince that he's not giving up America and NATO and the whole alliance to Putin, maybe he can sort of get out of this again.
Except that even Fox News didn't seem to have backed him up on this one, which was quite extraordinary.
Not on the sequence of Helsinki.
But at the end of the day, most of the American public doesn't give a damn about this whole story.
Really, even if this meeting goes ahead, if Vladimir Putin comes to town just before the midterm elections, will that happen?
Oh, let's say if he comes to town for the parade, the military parade, wouldn't that be nice? I think basically the American people don't care about this issue. This is very much an inside the Beltway issue, a Northeast Corridor issue. It's a huge issue for the world. It's an enormous issue for NATO and every member of NATO. And it's a life or death issue for people in Ukraine, Georgia, the Baltics, all over Eastern Europe. But it's not a huge issue in the United States.
But for Russia, it is important that Trump meets Putin to make Putin feel himself not isolated, equal. It is very important for Russia to be perceived after the Cold War equal to the United States. And they are not talking about regional conflicts, because Ukraine was not a very big issue during this meeting, as, for example, Syria or Iranian nuclear program. In this way, Putin wanted to show also that we are talking about global problems, and Ukraine is still a local or regional problem, which is in my neighborhood. And also, it is important that what is the approach of Donald Trump to some issues like Nord Stream, which the question was asked.
The gas pipeline that would bypass Ukraine.
If, for example, for Donald Trump, it is economical issue and not political as it is perceived in some countries of Eastern Europe, like in Poland, it means that he will not put the sanctions on the companies who are involved in this project, and that is what waiting for in Poland, for example, in Baltic states. Does Donald Trump consider that it is an economic project of Russia or political?
We already announced it was political.
He said already that it was both, actually, because I think that on this one, Trump is not naive. I mean, if there is one thing on which he's not naive, it is these energetic issues and the way he has criticized, so forcefully Angela Merkel on the question of Germany being captive. And he meant economically and politically in the hands of Russia, I think is pretty clear. Yeah. And that leads me to think that, to understand Trump and the whole sequence of his trip, European trip, one has to realize that this man cannot be judged by his words, because his words are random and crazy. And he can change what he says from the morning to the evening. We've seen it at NATO. We've seen it in Britain. We've seen it on Helsinki, where he contradicted himself totally. So we have to judge Trump's Russian policy mostly, I think, by what he does.
Yes, because what he is doing, it is even stronger than
exactly.
Towards Russia. But when we are talking about the words, I hear, for example, the experts from the Eastern European countries, they still are judging Donald Trump according to his words. And finally, they were very worried about if Americans will pronounce for the sanctions concerning the companies or not. So that's why he changing his mind every time, being, as he told, a stable genius. I think that...
Well,
but there is
if there's anything
worry,
that's going to be damaging to him about all this in the United States, it's precisely this back and forth, this changing his mind all the time, the indecisiveness. That doesn't play well. And we had a line in one of our stories that it was like a fat goldfish flopping around on the floor. He's just, I mean, he's just ridiculous to watch.
Yeah. Gregory Viscusi, as that press conference that Chris and Laure were attending on Monday was concluding, the Justice Department was announcing the arrest of an alleged Russian agent, Maria Butina, who'd been plucked from obscurity, it seems, trying to gain access both in the gun lobby and the Republican Party in the United States. It's just, Soviet era, familiar, same old, or?
We know the Russians were meddling in the election. I mean, there's no news in that. I mean, there's only, that story only has traction depending on what were her contacts within the Republican Party. And she did have contacts. I mean, the indictment mentions, it doesn't mention them by name, but it mentions individuals that she had contact with. It depends how high up that goes. In of itself, it doesn't add too much to what we already knew.
Yeah, but it's not just the Republican Party. It's the National Rifle Association, which gave $30 million toward electing Trump. And there's a lot of questions about where all that money came from. To be sure, the NRA is a rich organization, but that's a hell of a lot of dough to plow into a campaign. And her whole game was to play the NRA. She was the founder of, or a senior person in some kind of weird Russian pro-gun thing that sucked up to the NRA and was essentially created just for the purpose of sucking up to the NRA. And that was the vehicle that she used to approach Republicans and to approach
the only
other
importance of this
politicians.
will be on the American side, not on the Russian side.
All right, much more to come. We are going to talk about what's been going on in this country. When we come back, you're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. So is Elena Gabrielin of sister station Radio France International, Laure Mondeville, the Figaro newspaper, and Gregory Viscusi of Bloomberg News. We were talking in part one about Laure and Chris being in Helsinki. And while Trump and Putin were meeting there on Monday, the French, well, they were otherwise engaged. Hundreds of thousands on the Avenue des Champs-Élysées in Paris to welcome home World Cup winners France, victorious 4-2 the previous day in the final over Croatia. Les Bleus paraded from the Arc de Triomphe to the presidential palace, a second star in the national jersey, putting the French in the same league as football powerhouses like Argentina.
3 seconds for 3 hours wait, but we're really happy.
Very happy to have seen them, even a little bit. Allez les Bleus, we're world champions.
We're very happy. The flyover was there, the bus was there. We saw the players, we saw the World Cup. We're so happy. Listen to the fans.
Gregory Viscusi, were you cheering?
I thought Croatia were the better team, and I thought Belgium were the better team in the semifinals. But I was watching. Yes, I was watching.
You're clearly deluded.
How long are you planning to live here?
Well, more broadly, there is this feel-good moment, and in a lot of ways, the feel-good moment is different from the one of 20 years ago.
It'll be less than in '98. I mean, don't forget the '98. The French had never been in the final before. They hadn't even qualified for the previous 2 World Cups, and they win it. So it was much more of a, it was a first time. It was in France. I think that whole diversity thing was kind of new and positive then. It's kind of evolved since then. It's become a bit of a murkier issue. I just don't see the lasting impact this time as much as it was in '98.
What does it mean, this win? Is it just a sporting victory and nothing else?
No, it is more than that, I think. But of course, for the society, it is a very good moral boost, I think. For the generation who have seen the 1998, it is a nostalgia for the new generation to feel something new, this victory spirit. And I think that it is giving much more confidence to the society. But of course, I agree with Gregory, it is very short. And the impact of this celebration, I think, would not be very long. Not for the society, not for Emmanuel Macron, by the way, from political point of view, because, by the way, the political gain from the victory in 1998 for Jacques Chirac was important. His popularity increased for 15 points and towards 70%.
Yeah, but he was in a different position because it was a time of the prime minister was from a different party. So the prime minister at the time was taking all the flack for whatever wasn't going well. And Chirac was able to play the father of the nation thing, which is a traditional role of the French president. In Macron's case, he's taking the blame for anything that's not unpopular.
The front page headline in Le Figaro Monday, Le jour de gloire est arrivé, a line from the national anthem, the Marseillaise, the day of glory has arrived.
Yeah, I think it was, I think it's still an important event, and the French need victories, actually, and I would say that all nations need victories at some point, and individuals as well. And I think that after all that happened in the last few years, especially since 2015, with these terrible attacks on the French nation, on French symbols, on Charlie Hebdo, and then Nice, and then, Bataclan, etc. I think there was a need for something positive, something glorious and beautiful, and some kind of sense of unity, even if it's very fragile, as you say, and it's probably not going to last for long. But I think that the French bathed into this idea that, you have all these young French guys, some from the banlieue, others from other parts of France, and that they were really a team. And I think the French loved that team. They were attached psychologically to them. They loved this Mbappé, 19-year-old, this young guy, so incredibly, gifted and given a chance to just emerge. And there were some strong words also from some players like Griezmann saying, "We are so happy to be there for our country," and they were all expressing this. So I think it's particularly important in this moment of huge tension, of big pessimism, of huge divides in the society. At the same time, it's very fragile. But I think it's interesting that there was this, polemical. I don't know if you've seen it on Twitter about the fact that there was this American.
Trevor Noah.
Yes, Trevor Noah.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that.
Who is South African?
If you look at the heritage of the players, 17 nationalities represented, including 14 from the African continent. South African comedy show host Trevor Noah is claiming that Les Bleus as his own, prompting a letter from the French ambassador to Washington to remind the host of The Daily Show that the team is French and nothing else. Noah responding in kind.
When I'm saying they're African, I'm not saying it as a way to exclude them from their Frenchness, but I'm rather using it to include them in my Africanness. I'm saying, I see you, my French brother of African descent. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like somebody saying, oh, so if you play with your naked child, that's a problem, but if I do it, I'm a pedophile? Yeah, there's a big difference.
No, your thoughts on that, because in that exchange between the ambassador and him, seems to be...
I think there is a lot, actually. Yeah. There is a much deeper disagreement between the French and the Americans on the question of race and citizenship and how we relate as a nation to these issues. Because the Americans are absolutely convinced that they have the answer to the question of race. And they have been, and especially now, in the recent years, they've been absolutely obsessed with this idea of identity politics, that one has to relate to one's identity race, gender, etc., and forget about the national identity.
You had, for instance, one of the players after the match.
The French disagree with that.
One of the players after the match, Adil Rami, he said, "I'm proud to be French, and I'm proud to be Moroccan as well."
Yes, okay. I mean, nobody cares. I mean, nobody is going to contest that in France. But what the ambassador was unhappy about, and I think a lot of people also, is that this guy was saying, how can you see that these guys are French when you look at the color of their skin?
No,
you can't. He said you can't call that a French victory. It's obvious that it's an African victory.
He didn't say that. He didn't say that. I thought it was a very fascinating exchange about as you say, it's a fascinating exchange about the different views of diversity between France.
Assimilation versus multiculturalism.
I think that Trevor Noah's mistake was to speak for the players. I don't think he was trying to take away from their Frenchness, but his big mistake is to speak for them and not let them have their own voice about where they stand. On the other hand, the ambassador could have had a little more of a sense of humor. I mean, the letter's a little bit dry.
I know, but he seemed to imply that if you're black, you're not French. And this is ridiculous.
No.
Yes, I think he did. And
he wasn't as elegant about it as Obama was. Obama had much more elegant.
His first major speech. His first major speech since leaving office, Barack Obama, in Johannesburg for the centennial of Nelson Mandela's birth. He spoke of common hopes and common dreams that deliver practical benefits, so that people can draw on the energy and skill of all their people.
And it is a truth that is incompatible. Ask the French football team that just won the World Cup. Because not all of those folks look like Gauls to me, but they're French.
Which side is he on in this argument when you listen to that, Christopher Dickey?
Well, look, first of all, when we talk about the type of assimilation you have here in France, the French have been kidding themselves for a long time by claiming that there's no distinction between people on the basis of ethnicity, race, creed, etc., etc. Any of the young people who live in the 93 postal code, the 9-3, when they go to...
It's a working-class suburb north of Paris.
Well, not just working class. When they go to get jobs, and especially if their names are Ahmed or Mohammed or Pogba or Umtiti or Mbappe, they're going to have trouble getting jobs in this country, and nobody should kid themselves about that.
We certainly hear about people's origins every time there are riots or a terror attack. Yeah. Then they're very... And I know... And people always are reminded of their origins.
And let's not... I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but don't think that it's not an issue that Benalla, the guy who was the security guy for Macron, who's now in all that trouble, don't think it won't be made an issue that his name is Benalla.
You know, actually, when I was looking for searching in Google, I wrote Alexander Benalla. The first in the top of research is Google Trends is giving origin. So for me, it is very relevant. It means that I have the impression we are really obsessed by the idea of checking every time what is the origin, and it could be the problem in any case. But I think that even out of France, we had much more this debate about the origins of footballers than in France. For example, in Russia, I saw a lot of messages on Facebook of people saying that I support Croatia because it is the only white team in Europe.
Oh, I was wondering about that. That doesn't surprise me at all.
Even from members of parliament, not only from...
I thought one would support Croatia because they're a country of 4 million who are the underdogs. I thought that was why everyone was rooting for Croatia. But I'm sad to hear that.
Also, if you know the history of Croatia.
Yeah. Well, we're mentioning Alexandre Benalla. He was on that victory bus on Monday. Today, he's at the heart of the first big political scandal of the Macron presidency. The 27-year-old who ran security detail during the campaign finally sacked this Friday over the beating up of 2 demonstrators on May Day. Well, we don't actually know if they're demonstrators. They were at least at the demonstration, I should say. Benalla filmed wearing a police armband and riot police helmet, even though he's not a cop, and was simply there to observe crowd control. The presidency had discreetly suspended him for 2 weeks, hoping that was the end of it. The video, though, has now come to light, with 3 police officers under investigation for allegedly handing over their own footage to the presidential palace. Laure Mondeville, how big a scandal is this?
Well, I think it's going to depend on, how it's going to be handled, frankly. I think it's some kind of a scandal, and this guy...
There is a cover-up.
Yes, there was a cover-up. This guy used, some attributes of the police that he should never have used. He's going to be, sued, and there's going to be an investigation and a criminal process, etc. So it's serious, and I think what is the problem for the presidency is that they took it quite lightly at the beginning. They decided that they were going to, stop him for 15 days or so, and then they reintegrated him. But they should have informed actually the judicial authorities of what was going on.
They thought they could get away with it, or they're out of touch?
I think they thought that it would never come out, and it's not very easy to recognize him in that footage. They probably just thought that he's not. You can't tell who he is in the footage. It'll never come out. No one will figure out, and this whole thing we'll never know about it.
So they probably.
I presume that's what they were.
Probably, and I think also that the papers have underlined the sort of closeness between this Alexandre Benalla and the president. And the president, who is a guy who is used to, has come into power with this sort of commando of sort of team, sort of I would say assault team of
people who've been with him from the beginning, and this guy was with him from the beginning.
He didn't want to let him go. That's what is apparent, I think.
I would like to add, I think that the reason why French people are also very angry is not only this kind of scandals, which are like Russian dolls. You have a lot of scandals in one big scandal, but also the way how Emmanuel Macron is making his communication. Until now, when journalists were asking him to comment on this affair, he was escaping them. And the fact to not being close to the journalists and to explain, to be transparent, that is what we are waiting from Emmanuel Macron, the transparency, which is not guaranteeing.
He says he doesn't want to be a slave to the news cycle.
That's right.
Well, yeah, but at the same, it makes more angry people.
Should he be speaking out?
Of course he should be speaking out. First of all, he should have fired the guy quickly. Maybe he hadn't seen the video. But if you see the video, it's really damning.
Apparently, everyone was aware of this on like May 2nd. Everyone was aware of it, including the Interior Minister.
I'm not trying to exculpate him. I'm just saying the video is really damning. And in fact, if you look at it in slow motion, I know we're running it over and over again, but the thing that's really incriminating is when he steps over the guy and puts his heel into the guy's solar plexus, which is really extremely painful. And you can see, if you look at the entire video, you can see the guy a long time after he's been released, doubled over in considerable
there he is. That's
pain.
him there.
That's it.
You'll see it. There's a moment they force him down.
He's the guy in civilian clothing with the helmet on.
Yeah, he's the one. And now he gets him down on the ground.
Yeah,
now
there he goes. That's it.
It's thuggery.
You should be a referee doing VAR at the World Cup, analyzing a video like that.
And you'll see the guy is in considerable pain there.
What is it? All right, the fact that Macron has tried not to be a slave of the news cycle and therefore doesn't want to address it. What does it say about him?
But also Macron is distant from the press. It's not just not being a slave to the news cycle. It's not having any kind of rapport with the press. Ironically, for all that Donald Trump talks about the press as the enemy of the people, he talks to the press.
No, he loves
all the time. Macron
loves contact with
not just tweet.
But he loves contact. He loves contact.
He's granted a bunch of interviews this week.
I think that Trump actually is using. I mean, Trump is sort of surviving all these crises by creating a new agenda. He goes into another crisis, he tweets something else, and then the whole press is going to another topic and starts,
With Macron, it's a different strategy.
And Macron is just more silence, more distance, Jupiterian kind of style, as everyone is saying, sort of distanced. And
before we go, it was the week that saw Nicaragua's leaders mark the 39th anniversary of the overthrow of the Somoza dictatorship. This after crushing dissent and dismantling barricades in what was once a Sandinista stronghold, Masaya falling 3 months after the start of what began as peaceful protests against pension reform. The Catholic Church has tried to mediate, but longtime President Daniel Ortega is having no part of it.
As Christians, we are obliged to tell the truth and to ask the bishops to restore the love of God and not to support the satanic, murderous sect of plotters.
Christopher Dickey?
You know what I think of when I look at this? I mean, yes, it's true. I covered Nicaragua years ago. My first book was about Nicaragua. But when I look at this now, I think of Bashar al-Assad and Syria. That is really the beginning of Syria in Central America, Syria and the American continent, in the sense that you had peaceful demonstrations where people were asking for relatively limited goals, and the repression of the regime and the increasing repression of the regime is essentially going to create some kind of revolution. There is a desperate desire on the part of the people who are manning roadblocks all over the country not to have a violent revolution. But if you keep killing people, if you keep stepping on them, you will have one eventually.
Because the uprising, social uprising is transforming to rejecting power. And I have the impression that in Nicaragua, we turned this point when even when they are making step back and canceling the reform, people are still keeping to protest because of dictatorship, corruption, and human rights abuses. And that is something that during all the protest movements could be really very dangerous, where we cannot stop the violent movement.
And one of the ironies is the protesters are asking for Washington's help.
It's a bit of an irony, but it's just an example of why term limits exist. I mean, Well, he was supposed to only do 2 terms, and then he changed the Constitution for a 3rd, and that's when, I mean, just look at how many of these sort of situations around the world, across Africa, whether you're talking Congo, all sorts of countries have to do with people not respecting term limits.
Well, it's not just term limits. It's a question of using democracy to destroy democracy, using democratic vehicles of various kinds to destroy what we think of as democratic values. And believe me, that's not limited to Africa or Latin America.
But it's true that in Central America, if you look back, when this guy, Ortega, was sort of, he was the cherished boy of the left, sort of a symbol of revolution in Central America and Latin America. And when you see what it has become, and you look at Venezuela as well, I mean, you see this sort of descent into hell of these countries, which are, either into some kind of chaos or into dictatorship
but it has
corruption.
It has to be said that in Nicaragua, it's the safest country in Central America. And it had a relatively...
Not Costa Rica. You're forgetting Costa Rica.
Well, Costa Rica, we can talk about Costa Rica. But it's not because there was this huge economic crisis like you had in Venezuela. This is about Daniel Ortega and Rosario
trying to cling to power. Christopher Dickey, I want to thank you. I want to thank Laure Mondeville, Gregory Viscusi, Elena Gabrielon. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.
I wouldn't have talked so long if I'd known that was...
And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
Emma, the scandal, we were talking about it here in France with that guy in charge of security detail. I guess that's the way that's not his official job description, but it's kind of what he was.
Indeed, and it is interesting to see just how close he was to Emmanuel Macron on so many key occasions. And these sort of personal security people are normally very shadowy figures, but Alexandre Benalla is anything but that now. He's on the front page of Libération today with the headline, "Beware of the gorilla." Gorille is also a pejorative way of talking about a bodyguard as well, so it's a bit of a double meaning to that headline. Now, this wasn't new. It happened on May the 1st. The videos were circulating. It was only when he was identified by Le Monde, the French newspaper, that it became this huge political scandal, and it's unlikely to go anywhere anytime soon. Lots of people have questions, including, did the man who was assaulted by Alexandre Benalla file a complaint? Who is he? Now, according to Libé's Czech news page, the victim hasn't been identified. It's not known if he's filed a complaint either.
Nor there was a woman as well in a chokehold? No?
There was a woman, and there's also a new video that's emerged today which shows him trying to kick her legs from under her as he's holding her on the pavement. So some really shocking scenes being unveiled. Interestingly, Closer, the French magazine Closer, and not normally known for its good investigative reporting, but they seem to have more information on who the guy who was attacked was. They say that he was Greek, and that may explain why no one's yet found him. He gave a false name to police, gave the name of a Greek basketball player. He was in custody for 4 hours before they then released him. He was never charged with anything. And you do have to wonder, was he really part of any kind of protest movement on that day? We will have to wait and see if he is ever tracked down. As I said, lots of new videos emerging. This one really shows the brutality of Ben Allah in this video. Very, very clear image there. And not a good thing to see at all when you consider that he didn't lose his job at the Elysee afterwards. In fact, far from it. This is him in the bus. On the top of that bus, you can't see them, are Les Bleus. This was on Monday. He was accompanying the victorious French football team as they returned to Paris. So far from being low profile, we were told after his 2-week suspension, he'd been given a largely administrative role.
Administrative duties.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Doesn't look terribly administrative there. He is
No.
right in the heart of one of the biggest events that we've seen in Paris in quite some time. Le Parisien is looking at his history and wondering really whether he ever should have been allowed to work at the Elysee Palace. They talk about the itinerary of an impulsive man, and there are plenty of alarm bells here. He was sacked by a former minister, Arnaud Montebourg, 2012, I think this happened, after just 1 week working for him because he caused a car accident and then wanted to flee the scene. On another occasion, he was accompanying Emmanuel Macron by moped. He then had a puncture, left his gun behind in the seat, in a saddle seat. But what's even more interesting is that he didn't actually have a permit to carry a weapon at that point. So there are lots and lots of questions being asked. Perhaps one of the most serious allegations to be unearthed, though, is this one by L'Express, which says he was accused of assaulting a woman in 2015. L'Express believes it to have been a member of his family. The woman was actually signed off work for 8 days as a result of that assault, but he was later acquitted. But yes, the president's office denies knowing anything about that case, but obviously people are very unhappy, and it's not going to help Emmanuel Macron's popularity at all, because that is now at the lowest point since he was elected. 39%, according to the latest polls, having a favourable opinion of him.
So being in the dressing room on the day of the World Cup final...
It hasn't helped him. No World Cup bounce in popularity for him.
Some news from across the channel, please.
Yes, slightly sweeter news, or perhaps slightly less sweet. You may remember when Cadbury's was taken over by a US firm. Cadbury's an iconic British chocolate make. Chocolate fans really went into meltdown, excuse the pun. Now they're very upset because of changes to dairy milk, which is the kind of iconic chocolate bar that Cadbury's have produced for many, many years. It's the most significant innovation in the history of Cadbury's, according to this headline. Some people really going a little overboard. Some people really buying into this idea. The Sunday Times Style supplement tweeting this. They seem to be on board, stuffing their faces with chocolate, clearly thinking 30% less sugar. You're going to be good to eat as much as you like. And this woman too saying it's practically a superfood if it's got 30% less sugar. I have to say, my unscientific research on social media, I would say the majority don't like this idea. Don't mess with dairy milk, says this Twitter user. This one says, is nothing sacred in these difficult times? Very British response there. First, they came for our iron brew. They reduced sugar in that. Then they came for our dairy milk. And this Twitter user says, why do those of us with self-control have to be punished because others have none? Now, Cadbury's have been going around saying, don't panic, we'll still be making the originals. But perhaps most interestingly, Cadbury's themselves admit it's not actually going to be any healthier.
Oh, and here's the good news. For once, you can't blame it on Brussels. All right. Many thanks, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.